no one saw her work. Hardly anyone saw her work. So this art never had much traction in its day. When she died in 1963, all of this went into a box, leaving my grandfather to deal with this massive collection of paper. And my grandfather, was unsure about what to do with this. And he thought, well, she was just a person who hung out in her room, and these are just doodlings, and I don't know what to make of them. Maybe it's just time to pitch them. But instead, he sent them to my mom and said, you do something with these, and I'll just get them out of my house. They showed up at our house in the mid-1970s, and I can remember really clearly, my mom and I sitting down and opening the box.
We were living in Colorado, and we all as a family looked at them. I believe I met Mary Sully 3 times. I never knew at that point that she was doing any artwork. It was very hard to think of the person I had known as Aunt Susie having created all these amazing pieces about so many different people. My husband was really not interested in them. I put the box under our bed, and there it stayed for many years.
Mary Sully was born Susan Deloria in 1896. She was my great aunt. She was the daughter of Philip J. Deloria, the person I'm named for, and a woman named Mary Sully, also known as Akichitawin, soldier woman. Soldier woman, Mary Sully, was the daughter of Alfred Sully, who was American military commander, active in the Dakota region in the late 1850s. And his father was Thomas Sully, the famous antebellum American portrait painter. Her sister was Ella Deloria, who was just an exceptional student and scholar, and I think kind of a genius in her own right. Ella went to the Teachers College at Columbia. And then she got this letter from Franz Boas, one of the foundational figures in American anthropology. He would send her Dakota or Lakota language texts, and she would translate them. She goes to New York for maybe 6 months, and then he sends her out as a sort of field representative and sends her back to the Dakotas to start gathering up ethnographic information and linguistic information. So throughout the 1930s, she's back and she's forth, and Mary Sully comes with her. Neither of them marry, and they really do form a kind of a unit. And the two of them are kind of living together, and Ella's looking out for her because Mary Sully just really struggles to operate in the world. So Mary Sully is here in New York City, and she's a person who's very shy, who may have had sort of psychological and emotional challenges. But she seems to have been able to move through New York City with that kind of anonymous quality, right, of a person moving through the city. It seems entirely likely to me that Mary Sully would have come to the Met.
I'm so glad I can show you these today. These are these multi-panel, as you well know, these multi-panel pieces that we have to unfold in a rather careful manner. But it's the original confirmation that was done by the artist. And it's these incredible vivid colors. Mostly done in wax crayons and colored pencils. Sometimes you'll find graphite. And this one, which is, as you can see from the label, Edna St. Vincent Millay. The bottom labels are always done in pen. And sometimes though you find inscriptions on the back which give you more information or additional information.
Sometimes in graphite, right?
Sometimes in graphite underneath. And remarkably ruled. You can see how there's like careful lines for that.
And of course they've been in the dark for decades.
So the
Which is why they
palette,
are
incredible.
Yeah.
And this type of these hot pinks and these hot reds are very vulnerable to light, and particularly from this time period, you don't see them at this level of
Vibrancy.
vibrancy very often.
And while those seem hand-drawn, maybe not. They're so perfect. I mean, we're still trying to figure this out, right? What is she using? Is she using a tool, protractor? And clearly, she seems to start with one vignette and then starts replicating it, right? So whether, is it a stencil? Is it, I don't know if you have any further thoughts about that after examining it.
I feel like there's sometimes you see a compass mark or something to help you with the circle. It's not quite as, I don't think it's a stencil, but there may be some repeatable objects that were sort of traced. And I also wonder, because when you look at the underdrawing may have been done more precisely.
Right.
And then when she
Graphite.
went back with the pen and the pencil, it becomes a little more softer and more freehand.
Susan Deloria, Susie, took the name Mary Sully when she began making art, and throughout her entire career, she used that as her artist's name. There's 134 of these things she called personality prints, and this is this moment where, you know, old questions about character are giving way to new questions about personality. And what is personality, right? And how do we know it? And where does it come from? And I think for her, it's a throwback to her great-grandfather, to Thomas Sully, who arguably helped create, through portraiture, a whole generation of antebellum celebrities. But what has changed is the entire mass-mediated form that you can get your celebrities on radio and in film and, you know, all kinds of interesting places. And so the pool of celebrities is vastly expanded, but also the audience is vastly expanded. The world that Mary Sully is fascinated by, this was a world that Native people too were engaged in. And we oftentimes don't imagine that to be the case, but it is the case. In the triptychs, the top image is oftentimes representational. There are pictorial elements that are easily recognizable. There are symbols which carry larger kinds of resonance, and it's oftentimes abstract. And then when you know who the person is, suddenly the abstraction becomes more representational as you can understand there's something about that person's life. And then in the second panel, she takes colors, themes, icons, shapes, and she converts them into a repeating design pattern. And I think this is her love of design and her aspiration for industrial design. And this bottom panel, which I've thought of as being kind of the Indian abstract, is a kind of a claim to modernism, to modernist abstraction with a geometrical kind of sensibility that is on the one hand kind of modernist, but is also very, very native and very Dakota, right, in its particularities. I think her interest in art and design goes way back to when she's a child, doing beadwork and moccasin work. Like most young women in the Dakota context, she was learning these kinds of things. So I have to be grateful for conservation for this, because this is kind of amazing. I mean, this has always been one of my favorites.
But I love to imagine, too, they're living on the Upper West Side, near Columbia. St. John the Divine is going up at this time. It's unfinished today, right? But so there's a direct reference to that experience. And her Episcopalian faith, again, right? It kind of surfaces again.
Here, you know, you've got this sort of sense of being flat on your back on a street in New York, looking straight up and seeing skyscrapers.
The canyons, that's amazing.
Yeah. Looking at each, and particularly each of these bottom panels, you know, where the native element becomes sort of just flat out pictorial, right? And sort of ethnographic, you know, almost a link, I think, to some of the ethnographic illustrations that she was doing.
Well, one of the things that really struck me about the bottom panels was that she consistently represents pairs of items. This possibly was a reference to her close relationship with her sister. You see it again and again, and it's often two items or two hair ties or two umbilicus holders that the two sisters may have had. In so many different ways, she's referencing her relationship with her sister Ella, and I just think that's very important.
Yeah, I think this sort of sense of connection, of relationality, of correspondence, which is so important, right, in thinking about Dakota epistemologies, how these things, you know, do and don't fit together, but mostly do fit together, right? I mean, for me, the thing that's so striking here, Lunt and Fontaine, this was the first couple, you know, of the stage. The lavender reflecting the sort of lavender marriage and the fact that Lunt was gay and this was a sort of cover. But the real thing that matters is that couple stayed together for their entire career and like really loved each other and took care of each other. So this caring, loving relationship within a kind of troubled social kind of environment, and what better way to reflect it than the sort of parfleche kind of tied together in that sort of marriage bow. It's really a beautiful sentiment, and in some ways like a really powerful critique, right, of the social moment in which these folks lived.
People often talk about artists as being ahead of their time, and I would say that what I've noticed about practicing artists is that they're most in tune with the time that they're in. And I would say she was very in tune with the world around her, with what was going on, and had a very sensitive way of reading everyone around her and what she was engaging with and what really caught her interest.
So Mary Sully died in 1963. So after my dad passed in 2005, we pulled out the suitcase and we started looking at them, and I thought, these are actually really cool. I don't feel like I should hoard them and keep them to myself. I feel like the world should know them. Because here's a woman who died never thinking that her art was ever going to do anything in this world. And I think what it surfaces, for me, is the real importance of Native women, particularly across the late 19th and early 20th century, in that moment when Native people are seeing and thinking and engaging this sort of new modern world of America at this time in really intelligent, critical, politically aware kind of ways that are aimed at preserving Native life and Native culture. For me, Mary Sully is the gateway into thinking about what that group looks like. That will change the ways in which we think about Native art.